As SpaceX gets into testing of the Starship Flight 8 vehicles, there has been even more work done on Pad B's Chopsticks, including the time-consuming work of reeving the cable for their carriage system. Plus, we can see SpaceX preparing the hardware needed for Starship's first Starlink launch. What's up, Tank Watchers? I'm Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Let's start off with what a whole lot of you are probably looking forward to most, Starship's next launch. While we don't yet have a firm timeline for Starship Flight 8, we do know that both vehicles that will be used for it, Booster 15 and Ship 34, need to complete their engine test campaigns first. If you've watched our recent Starbase Update episodes, you'll know that we've been seeing signs that this test campaign was inching closer, and lo and behold, that testing is finally here. On top of everything from previous weeks, this week we saw SpaceX purging the 20 quick disconnect umbilicals that connect to the booster's 20 outer Raptor engines, or as I like to call them, the 20 outer mounty guys. We also saw purges of the main booster quick disconnect, which is the one that supplies the propellant, power, data, and the other commodities to a booster that it needs before launch. These days, SpaceX only does these purges when it's close to testing a booster on the launch mount. Earlier in the week, we saw a booster transport stand moving to the production site from Sanchez, which was an obvious sign that at least a booster was going to be leaving the Mega Bay. I know some people were hoping that this would be for Booster 14, which would have been cool. Being the second Super Heavy booster to be caught, there's a non-zero chance that SpaceX could decide to refly Booster 14. So, of course, some people thought Booster 14 was going to be rolling out for a second test campaign ahead of its potential next flight. Now, it's not unlikely for Booster 14 to be reused. After all, SpaceX reflew the second Falcon 9 that landed successfully, and it did so with a multi-million-dollar payload on top. SpaceX doesn't have that risk now, and if they wanted to relaunch a Super Heavy booster, well, there's no customers on board, so if they want, they can take that risk. So then the question is, would Booster 14 be ready to fly again for Flight 8? Probably not. And if they reuse it, it would make sense to get a really good look at everything on the vehicle and save it for another flight later on down the line. The booster speculation fun time didn't last long though, as the booster that was moved was indeed Booster 15, which was lifted off of its workstation inside the Mega Bay and placed on the aforementioned transport stand. There was a road closure for a transport from the production site to the launch site early morning on Saturday, and without wasting much time, SpaceX used it to move Booster 15 down to the launch site basically at the beginning of the road closure window, which doesn't always happen. Even before sunrise, the booster had already been lifted and installed onto the orbital launch mount. SpaceX must really be in a hurry to test Booster 15, given the pace at which they were moving to get it at the launch site. One way or the other, it's fantastic to see the speed of these things increasing. In fact, Cameron County issued 3 road closures for testing for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Central. This means that by the time you are watching, SpaceX might have already performed engine testing on Booster 15. Now don't think I forgot about Ship 34 just because I talked about Booster 15 first. We're also keeping a close eye on that vehicle, and as of the time of recording, it's still hiding inside of Mega Bay 2. That said, there are signs that its own engine test campaign might be coming up soon. Earlier this week, we saw a pair of SPMTs, or self-propelled modular transporters, rolling up Highway 4 out to the Massey outpost. There aren't a lot of things that they can pick up from the Massey outpost other than, perhaps, the ship's static fire stand, which normally resides there. We also saw road closures come out this week for a transport from the production site to Massey's. Furthermore, this week we also saw SpaceX carrying the second 4-point lifter to Mega Bay 2, which could indicate a ship lift would be happening soon. There, Ship 34 will be lifted off from its workstation inside of Mega Bay 2 and placed on the static fire stand. Then, Ship 34, sitting on the static fire stand, will be rolled out to the Massey outpost for engine testing, as we've seen happen many times before. All that, however, would be happening right after I'm recording this, so I bet our editor Ryan is putting together some nice shots of what actually happened on Sunday and Monday. Fun fact, I recorded this on Saturday. Thanks, SpaceX, for doing stuff over the weekend. If Ship 34 is indeed now at Massey's by the time you're watching, then the next question is, when fire? Well, it's a lot more complicated than when there's testing at the launch site. Testing at the Massey outpost does not require closures of Highway 4, only the road that goes out to Massey's, and it's not a public road, and there's no public notices of when that road is going to be closed. So, As with previous testing at Massey's, we'll have to play it by ear and pay attention to when the road to Massey's is closed, as that and venting from the tank farm are basically our only indicators. However, we often have to be careful in how we interpret when that road is closed. While a Ship 34 test will indeed need a closure of the road, the opposite might not be true. That is, the road being closed might not mean that there will be a Ship 34 test. The reason I say this is because there's another vehicle at Massey's right now that could be tested, if we even want to call it a vehicle. And that vehicle is Test Tank 16. If you remember from the last few weeks, Test Tank 16 was sitting around at the Sanchez lot before being then moved to the Star Factory. There, teams seem to have been working on the test tank for a while, but the only things we could see through the windows were the installation of new ramps on the sides where the stringers are. These are very similar to the ones that were installed on Ship 33, and that might be installed on future vehicles to protect the sides of the ship from the slaps of the chopsticks during a catch. These are also similar to the ones that we saw flapping around during ascent, so SpaceX probably wanted to use Test Tank 16 to install sturdier ramps that don't go loose on the way up. After all that work in the Star Factory, SpaceX rolled Test Tank 16 out to the Massey outpost this week. At first, it didn't look like these ramps were much of a big deal. Looking at its outside, the test tank doesn't have any new major features other than the vents on the engine section were covered. The same vents that Elon said were not enough to vent out the fires that started on Ship 33. So it seemed highly unlikely that the whole reason to move this tank to Massey's was to test those ramps, or so we thought. In the last few days though, we saw the addition of 2 bars welded to the top of the tank. And now SpaceX has added on the sides what appear to be a subscale version of the chopstick arms, even with bumpers and everything. It seems like SpaceX may be using Test Tank 16 to see how the chopstick bumpers interact with the new ramp design without needing to put it out here at Pad B. Now, you might remember from earlier in the episode that I talked about the possibility of reflying Booster 14. We saw last week how they moved the chines from the vehicle into the Star Factory, and as of this week, they still remain inside of it. This was another way of guessing that this vehicle was likely not going to be coming out for testing, at least not yet. That said, it is true that it has already been inside of the Mega Bay for longer than Booster 12 was after it was caught. Booster 14 has not gone anywhere yet, so it could be that it's undergoing inspections and refurbishment for a second flight. So when could that happen? It might be tempting to check what the turnaround time for the first Falcon 9 booster to be reused was, but there are a few issues with that. The first one is that the first Falcon 9 to be reused was the very first SpaceX rocket to be reused, and so they didn't have anywhere near as much knowledge as they have today. They were also a lot smaller of a company, and they were also launching at a much lower cadence than now, a cadence that, at its best, is on par with the current Starship launch cadence. On top of that, SpaceX was also only flying customer payloads at the time, which meant extra checks were needed to ensure a successful mission. And to add even more to the mix, SpaceX suffered a pad explosion of a Falcon 9 rocket that moved timelines even further, which meant the first booster turnaround took nearly a year. SpaceX does not have that problem with Starship and Super Heavy. The only payloads that might be flying soon are their own Starlink satellites, so they can take the extra risk for now. SpaceX also has a lot more people working on these vehicles and a whole lot more experience reusing boosters. So reusing a Super Heavy booster might not take as long, and reflying Booster 14 would give SpaceX enough time to finish some of the upcoming Super Heavy vehicles like Booster 16 and 17. If such a thing were to happen, then SpaceX could accelerate their cadence and be able to fly without being constrained by booster production. However, ship production could still be a constraint, at least until they start catching ships. The first potential ship to be caught could come as early as Ship 35, which was fully stacked just last week. If you watched our previous Starbase update episode, we had seen this ship's aft section entering Mega Bay 2 for what we expected was going to be the final stack of the vehicle. Earlier this week, we saw the stand that was used to move the ship aft section from the Star Factory to the Mega Bay 2 exiting the building. This confirmed that this aft section had now been welded to the rest of the ship. Then, later in the week, the door of Mega Bay 2 was rolled open, and we were able to see that Ship 35 had been moved from the welding turntable to the center workstation in Mega Bay 2. You might also recall that when I talked about Ship 34 potentially going out for engine testing, I mentioned that SpaceX moved a second 4-point lifter to Mega Bay 2. That's because the first one was being used to lift Ship 35, but this one was also removed from this vehicle. It wouldn't be surprising if we see a shuffle in the coming days inside of Mega Bay 2, with Ship 34 coming out and going to Massey's for testing, but also Ship 35 being moved to one of the workstations on the left-hand side of the structure. With the welding turntable now vacated, work can begin to stack Ship 36 inside of Mega Bay 2. If you remember from last week, we talked about how Ship 36's nose cone had already been welded to its payload bay section. This week, we saw SpaceX rolling the PEZ dispenser for this ship inside of Mega Bay 2, a step needed before continuing this vehicle's construction. While the nose cone and payload bay are welded together, the PEZ dispenser is missing, and the way they install that on Block 2 Starships is by sleeving the dispenser with the nose cone and bay assembly. The dispenser is then secured and welded to the payload bay section, and SpaceX can continue welding the ship with the next barrel section, which in this case would be the forward dome section. But that was not the only PEZ dispenser we saw this week. SpaceX has been gearing up for operational flights of Starlink satellites on Starship by building a Starlink satellite loader. This is very similar to the one that SpaceX had built a few years ago, but that was eventually scrapped. That box was only built for Block 1 of the ship, and it was never really used in a proper scenario. The only time we saw it being used was when they tested loading procedures with Ship 24, and, well, we never saw them try again, so they likely scrapped the entire idea altogether. On last week's flyover, we saw just the new box from the air inside of the high bay, but this week we also saw the PEZ dispenser being installed inside of the box. But this is a different type of PEZ dispenser because it lacks the systems needed to move down the stack of satellites when a pair of them is released. This is because, unlike the one used for flight, the PEZ dispenser used on the loader box will be under gravity, so it doesn't need a mechanism to lower the satellites, it can just use gravity. The best part is no part. So, whenever SpaceX wants to load Starlinks on any future ship, the procedure may look something like this. The satellites are loaded inside of the box while inside of the Star Factory and in a controlled environment. The box is then closed and rolled to Mega Bay 2, where a ship will be waiting for it. One of the bridge cranes then would take the box and lift it up to the payload bay door, which would be open to enable the transfer of satellites. These would then go, pair by pair, from the PEZ loader in the payload box to the ship's PEZ dispenser for flight. This pales in comparison to the way we saw SpaceX load the Starlink simulator satellites on Ship 33 for Flight 7. And it also keeps the satellites from having to be exposed for too long to the salty, dusty air environment of Starbase. What we don't know for sure yet is when this process might actually happen. For all we know, SpaceX may decide to repeat on Flight 8 what it was planning for Flight 7, and load more dummy Starlinks, or dumblinks as I like to call them, inside Ship 34. But maybe this process can still be used for loading those dumblinks. It might not be a bad idea to test this loading procedure with non-functional versions of the satellites first. We'll see. This week, we've also seen more ship hardware arriving at Starbase, with at least 2 ship flap deliveries to the production site. Earlier this week, SpaceX delivered what appeared to be an aft flap, which might be used on Ship 35 since it's the earliest ship without aft flaps. Later in the week, there was another flap delivered, and this one looked a lot more like a forward flap because of its thickness and shape. Since ships 34, 35, and 36 already have their forward flaps, this could be for some future vehicle like Ship 37 or beyond. That's enough about future vehicles for now, because we have to bid farewell to an old vehicle, and that is of course Ship 32, or so we think. This ship was fully stacked all the way back in November of 2023, and then was moved to the Rocket Garden 2 months later in January of 2024. It's been around for a while. It sat at the Rocket Garden for over a year, sometimes being changed from one place to another, but still sitting in the Rocket Garden. This week though, SpaceX moved Ship 32 to the high bay, where it's likely going to get scrapped. This is the only Block 1 vehicle remaining, and despite it being fully stacked, it was actually never complete. For example, it was missing a bunch of tiles, its raceways, and also its aft flaps. With Block 2 ships already around, it doesn't make sense to keep old vehicles like Ship 32, and so it makes sense that it might be scrapped. And yes, I know Ship 20 is still hanging around, but that thing is a whole lot closer to the vehicles from the serial number era, just with tiles and Raptor vacuum engines. It's not really a proper Block 1 vehicle. It's more like Block 0.5. One interesting piece of information that came out this week was in this permit filed by SpaceX to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. In this document, it states that it's for the construction of a medical facility. The address given on the document suggests that this facility will be built in the village at the LBJ Boulevard right behind the Astropub. It makes sense to build such a facility as SpaceX continues to move ahead with making Starbase its own municipality and with an expansion of the village right around the corner. Elsewhere at Starbase, we've also seen work to repair the mural on the parking garage that was damaged during the large storm that took place a couple of weeks ago. For now, it seems like workers are just stripping some of the outer layer of the mural and replacing blown out panels, so we'll have to see where that work goes. Where we have seen a lot of work this week though has been at Pad B, especially preparing the chopsticks and carriage system for operational use. Last week, of course, was all about installation of the chopsticks and carriage on the tower, and we saw the traveling block installed on the chopsticks and carriage as well. This week though, it's been all about reeving the cable for the carriage system. Although, to be a little bit more precise, this is not the cable that's going to be used to lift the carriage system and chopsticks. What teams are doing right now is using a pull line, a cable that aids on pulling the cable that's actually going to be used for this system. It's really quite a complicated process because the cable needs to go from the dead spool at the base of the tower all the way up to the top, where it then travels to the front of the tower and down to the traveling block on the carriage system. There, it needs to be reeved to the other side and then goes back up to the top of the tower again to the crown block. Then, it travels down the front of the tower again to the traveling block, repeating this loop up to 6 times. On the last loop, the cable goes to the top of the tower again, but this time to the pulley system that brings it to the back of the tower. There, it travels down to the base where the drawworks are located. And mind you, this is done on a tower that's over 140 meters tall, which means this cable has to be at least over 1 kilometer long, since it does 6 loops between the crown block and the traveling block, and it also does 1 trip up the tower and another trip down the tower. It's like threading a needle, but at an industrial scale. Starship scale, if you will. Now that this pull line is in, teams will have to pull from the cable spool to unwind it and make it go through all of the places we mentioned before to form the entire block and tackle system. Now, installing all of this will make the carriage system be able to travel up and down the tower, but it will not make the chopsticks work, as in being able to open and close, which is kind of important if you want to catch a Starship. To do that, SpaceX needs to install the hydraulic actuators that do this work. This week, SpaceX rolled one of those actuators down Highway 4 to the launch site and installed it on the left arm, as viewed from the tower's own point of view. These also won't work until they're plugged into all the chopstick hydraulic systems that will be used to drive the actuators. This means there's still a bit of work until these chopsticks can be used, but it does seem like SpaceX is in quite a hurry to get them operational, which would fit with the theory that perhaps they may be used on Flight 9 to catch Ship 35. If we compare these chopsticks to Pad A's, those were installed in October of 2021 and were tested just in time for the first lift of a ship with chopsticks by February of 2022. It's not impossible to think that with the extra experience SpaceX has now, and the further emphasis they are doing on getting them ready for operations, that this 4-month timeline could be halved to about 2 months. Once the systems are in place, we'll have to see teams testing the chopsticks, especially with those hilarious giant water bags that simulate the weight of a vehicle. And if they really want to catch a ship soon, then we're going to have to see even further testing, perhaps even doing something like we saw at Pad A, where they used a subscaled version of a booster to test booster catches. And yes, I know Test Tank 16 is at Massey's, but perhaps there'll be some other test vehicle that actually gets put through the testing right here at the pad itself. But when do you think the chopsticks will be ready to go? Let us know in the comments. I'm guessing March. But as we always say, the work to get Pad B ready is not just at the launch pad itself, but also at the Sanchez lot, where SpaceX is working on the launch mount and flame bucket for Pad B. The work on the launch mount is happening day and night, non-stop. Teams of workers are welding on the launch mount constantly to get it up to a ready state. That being said, since our last episode, some more of the scaffolding on the top of the mount has been removed, which is a good sign it's getting closer to completion. I was also able to go around the back of Sanchez and into the mud to take another view of the launch mount. Zooming in and peeking through the scaffolding, we can see a big pipe running along the side of the launch mount at its base. It's hard to guess what this pipe will be for, but it wouldn't be surprising if this were related to the water cooling system on the launch mount. Speaking of, SpaceX is also making great progress on the water-cooled flame deflector that will go in the flame trench at Pad B. When SpaceX started putting it together, only one side was being worked on, and in my trip into the mud, it seems like those pipes have now been fully welded to the big pipe that will distribute the water to these little curved pipes. Is that called a manifold? I think it's called a manifold. Now the other side has also been getting a lot more pipes, and it appears that almost all of them are installed, at least compared to our flyover last week. Once both the launch mount and the flame bucket are completed, they'll be ready to head down Highway 4 and be installed over the flame trench that's also being worked on at Pad B. But these pieces of hardware won't be of any use if there isn't a working tank farm at the pad to supply all of the propellants and the water for the deluge system. This week, we saw the delivery of more pumps to the tank farm, which will be pumping all the cryogenic propellants out to Pad B. We explained in our last Starbase update how all of this might work, with aerial views and everything, so take a look at that for a complete rundown. One interesting piece of new hardware for the tank farm, though, has been a pair of giant industrial fans from a company called Howden. The weird thing, though, is that two were transported to the pad, but at least as of recording, only one was lifted and unloading from the delivery truck and into the tank farm. The other one appeared to leave Starbase. It would seem like this kind of big fan could be used to air out the nitrogen being dumped by the subcoolers and other places where a lot of nitrogen is being vented and could pool and become a hazard for workers once they return to the pad. We've seen similar fans at Massey's tank farm, just at a smaller scale. So it wouldn't be surprising to see this implemented at the larger tank farm at the launch site. One thing that we're hoping to see soon is the rollout of the tanks that are being staged at the port of Brownsville. These appear to be for the water deluge system, which, just like the one at Pad A, will involve a pressurized water system instead of a traditional water tower like we see, for example, at the Cape. This pressurized water system necessitates water storage tanks and a nitrogen pressurization system so that it can push huge amounts of water through the system. There are still a few more months to go, but with all of this work going on, Pad B is looking a lot more like a real launch pad and looks like it'll be active sooner rather than later. As mentioned earlier in the video, we expect Flight 8 testing to be happening very soon, so check back next week for Starbase Update to see what exactly happened with that testing. For now, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget, be excellent to each other.